How much do you really know about your neighbors? Can you ever truly trust the people smiling across the picket fence? Heather had it all, or so it seemed. She was the picture-perfect PTA mom, always hosting bake sales and attending book clubs. But there was something lurking beneath her polished exterior. Evan, her neighbor, seemed like the perfect family man too. He had two adorable kids, a beautiful wife named Lisa, and a picture-perfect life of his own. Yet, late at night, Heather and Evan's phones buzzed with messages they wouldn't want anyone else to see. It started as casual chats, then evolved into something more. Before long, secret rendezvous were happening behind closed doors, far from the watchful eyes of their spouses and the judgmental PTA. Heather thought they were careful. She thought no one noticed. But someone always notices. Was Lisa, Evan's wife, oblivious to the affair? Or was she quietly piecing it all together? Lisa wasn't the type to cause a scene. She was calm, composed, the kind of woman who never raised her voice. But Lisa had a way of noticing things, small changes in Evan's routine, a lingering glance between him and Heather at a neighborhood barbecue. It wasn't long before she started to connect the dots. A misplaced text on Evan's phone. A hurried excuse about a late-night errand. Lisa didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the evidence was piling up. One evening, she decided to confront Evan. "Is there something you need to tell me?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. Evan denied it, of course, brushing off her suspicions. But Lisa wasn't convinced. She began keeping a closer eye on Heather, watching her movements, noticing the tension every time they were in the same room. Something wasn't right, and Lisa was determined to find out what it was. How quickly can a secret unravel when people start to talk? The Connecticut suburb where Heather and Evan lived was a close-knit community. Everyone waved hello and swapped pleasantries, but beneath the surface, gossip was currency. It didn't take long for neighbors to start noticing little things, Heather spending more time in her garden when Evan was outside, or their shared laughter lingering just a little too long at block parties. Soon, whispers spread. "Have you seen the way Heather looks at Evan? Poor Lisa. Do you think she knows?" The rumors grew louder, and even though no one dared to say anything directly, the icy stares at PTA meetings and awkward silences at school drop-offs said it all. Heather brushed it off at first. But as the tension in the neighborhood grew, so did her paranoia. She knew Lisa was watching, and Heather began to wonder if Evan's wife would be the one to blow their secret wide open. Why didn't Lisa just walk away? Why did she confront Heather instead of keeping quiet? Lisa had spent weeks gathering the courage to face Heather. It wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about the humiliation. She couldn't bear the idea of being the topic of neighborhood gossip while Heather walked around pretending nothing had happened. One afternoon, Lisa cornered Heather in the school parking lot after a PTA meeting. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm. Heather froze, her confident smile faltering for a split second. Lisa didn't yell or cause a scene. Instead, she calmly laid out what she knew, the texts, the sneaking around, the way Evan had changed. Heather denied it at first, but Lisa's steely gaze didn't waver. "I'm not stupid, Heather." "This stops now," Lisa said before walking away, leaving Heather shaken. It wasn't a screaming match, but it was enough to rattle Heather. Lisa's quiet resolve hinted at something deeper. She wasn't going to let this slide so easily. How do you keep pretending everything is fine when the walls start closing in? After Lisa's confrontation, Heather felt like she was walking on thin ice. Every PTA meeting, every neighborhood event became a stage where she had to act like nothing was wrong. But the pressure was mounting. Evan tried to reassure her. "She doesn't have proof," he said. "She's bluffing." But Heather wasn't so sure. Lisa's calm demeanor during the confrontation had unnerved her. It wasn't the reaction of someone who was guessing, it was the reaction of someone who knew. Heather started to overcompensate, throwing herself into PTA projects and neighborhood events, hoping to drown out the whispers. But the more she tried to act normal, the more people noticed something was off. It was only a matter of time before the truth caught up with her. Was Heather willing to risk everything to keep her life intact? Heather's nerves were frayed. The once harmless affair had turned into a nightmare. She couldn't look Lisa in the eye without feeling a mix of guilt and fear. Every glance from a neighbor felt like an accusation. She even started avoiding Evan, terrified their connection would make things worse. One night, in a moment of desperation, Heather decided to send Lisa a message. She typed furiously, her fingers trembling as she wrote, "Stay out of my business, or you'll regret it." She didn't think twice about the words, assuming they would intimidate Lisa enough to back off. But Heather underestimated Lisa. Instead of retreating, Lisa became even more determined. The message wasn't just a threat, it was evidence. And Lisa knew exactly how to use it. Why didn't Lisa back down after Heather's message? The threatening text might have silenced someone else, but not Lisa. Instead, it lit a fire inside her. She read the message over and over, the words burning into her mind. "Stay out of my business, or you'll regret it." It wasn't just a threat, it was proof that Heather had something to hide. Lisa saved the message and began documenting everything. Every time she saw Heather near Evan, every strange look, every hushed conversation, they all went into a growing file of evidence. Lisa wasn't sure what she would do with it yet, but she knew she needed to protect herself. Heather had underestimated her, and that was a mistake. Heather, meanwhile, was spiraling. She regretted sending the text almost immediately, but convinced herself it would scare Lisa into submission. What she didn't realize was that Lisa was more than ready to fight back. How much did Evan understand about the growing tension between Heather and Lisa? While the two women were locked in a silent war, Evan seemed blissfully unaware, or maybe he just didn't care. He continued to play both sides, reassuring Heather that Lisa would never find out while dismissing Lisa's suspicions as paranoia. But deep down, Evan knew the situation was getting out of hand. Heather was growing clingy, texting him at all hours, demanding to know if Lisa had said anything. And Lisa was becoming colder, her once warm demeanor replaced by icy stares and curt responses. Evan tried to keep things from unraveling, but his attempts only made things worse. Heather began to resent him for not standing up to Lisa, and Lisa grew more determined to expose the affair. Evan, the man who had set this entire drama in motion, was quickly losing control. Why didn't Heather end the affair when things started to unravel? Heather had thought about it many times. The guilt, the fear of being exposed, it all weighed heavily on her. But every time she considered ending things with Evan, she hesitated. Maybe it was the thrill of the forbidden, or maybe it was the fear of what Lisa might do if she walked away. Instead of pulling back, Heather doubled down. She started keeping tabs on Lisa, trying to anticipate her next move. She even began crafting a story to cover her tracks, just in case the affair came to light. But the deeper she dug, the harder it became to climb out. Lisa, on the other hand, saw Heather's desperation as a sign that she was winning. But Lisa underestimated just how far Heather was willing to go to protect her secret. How does a simple affair escalate into something more sinister? By now, the tension between Heather and Lisa had reached a boiling point. Heather's paranoia grew worse with each passing day, and Lisa's quiet determination only fueled the fire. The small Connecticut suburb that once felt so idyllic now felt like a pressure cooker, ready to explode. Then, one fateful night, Heather made a decision that would change everything. She sat in her kitchen, staring at her phone, debating her next move. She couldn't let Lisa ruin her life. In a moment of desperation, she searched for something, anything, that could give her the upper hand. The next morning, Lisa found an anonymous note in her mailbox. It was vague, but threatening enough to send a chill down her spine. She knew it was from Heather, but she had no proof. Lisa was more determined than ever to expose the truth, but she didn't realize she was playing a dangerous game. How does a simple confrontation spiral into something deadly? Heather didn't wake up one morning intending for things to take such a dark turn, or at least that's what she told herself. But the fear of losing everything consumed her. The affair, the whispers, the confrontation with Lisa, it was all becoming too much. And then there was the threatening text. Heather knew she'd crossed the line, but instead of stopping, she kept going. One night, she sat in her dimly lit living room, scrolling through her phone. She found herself searching for things she never imagined she'd look up: sedatives, doses, and ways to make someone calm down. It wasn't a plan yet, just a desperate attempt to figure out how to regain control. But the thoughts were there, growing darker with each passing day. Did Lisa see the danger coming? Lisa was no stranger to tension. She had been dealing with Heather's subtle threats and Evan's lies for months. But there was something different in the air now, a sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake. Heather's behavior had become increasingly erratic. Lisa started noticing strange things: a neighbor mentioning they saw Heather parked near her house late at night, odd phone calls where no one spoke on the other end. One evening, Lisa confided in her sister, who urged her to go to the police. "It's probably nothing," Lisa said, brushing it off. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't ignore the unease. She decided to keep her distance from Heather and focus on protecting herself and her children. But Heather wasn't done. In fact, she was just getting started. What pushes someone to take a step they can never undo? For Heather, it happened one late night after another argument with Evan. He had called her out of the blue, frustrated and tired of the drama. "We need to stop this," he said. "It's over." Heather begged him to reconsider, but he hung up, leaving her feeling abandoned and cornered. Fueled by anger and desperation, Heather made a choice. She drove to a nearby pharmacy, using cash to purchase an over-the-counter sleep aid. But she didn't stop there. Through an online marketplace, she found someone selling prescription sedatives, claiming it was for anxiety. Heather didn't ask questions. She just bought them. As she held the pills in her hand later that night, she tried to convince herself that it wasn't what it looked like. Just to scare her, she whispered to herself, "She needs to stop." But deep down, Heather knew there was no turning back. What would make Lisa go to the school parking lot that night? The evening before Lisa was found, Heather sent her a cryptic message: "We need to talk. Meet me tomorrow after drop-off." Lisa debated whether to go, but ultimately decided she couldn't keep living in fear. She wanted answers, and maybe even closure. That night, Lisa tucked her kids into bed and wrote in her journal, something she had started doing to process her feelings about Evan and Heather. Her last entry was brief: "Tomorrow, I confront her for the last time. I need to end this." Heather, on the other hand, spent the night preparing. She rehearsed what she would say, but her mind kept drifting to the small vial of pills in her bag. She didn't have a plan, just a mix of panic, anger, and desperation fueling her every thought. What really happened in that parking lot? The next morning, the school drop-off buzzed with the usual chaos: kids running, parents chatting. But by mid-morning, the calm suburban routine was shattered. Lisa's car was discovered in the parking lot, her body slumped over the steering wheel. At first glance, it appeared to be an overdose. A bottle of pills lay on the passenger seat, along with a note scribbled in shaky handwriting. But something didn't add up. Lisa wasn't known to struggle with substance abuse, and her family insisted she had no reason to harm herself. The police were called, and the investigation began. Heather, standing among the concerned parents, tried to keep her composure. But inside, she was unraveling. She hadn't meant for this to happen, at least, that's what she kept telling herself. Yet, as the police began piecing things together, the cracks in Heather's story started to show. The police wasted no time in investigating Lisa's death. What initially seemed like an accidental overdose quickly raised questions. The prescription bottle found in Lisa's car was traced back to a pharmacy in another state, and the name on the prescription didn't match Lisa's. Detective Marlowe, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for details, was assigned the case. He noted the inconsistencies immediately. Lisa's family insisted she wasn't taking any medication and had no history of drug abuse. Her husband, Evan, seemed shocked and distraught, but was cooperative with the investigation. Heather, meanwhile, was a picture of controlled panic. She watched from her kitchen window as the police interviewed neighbors. Every knock on a door made her pulse race. She told herself to stay calm, but the more questions the police asked, the more her carefully constructed facade began to crack. The breakthrough in the case came from Lisa's phone records. Detective Marlowe discovered a string of threatening text messages sent to Lisa in the weeks leading up to her death. The sender's number was unregistered, but the phrasing was telling. The messages were laced with veiled threats, like "you'll regret it if you don't back off" and "I can make things much worse for you." When Marlowe brought the evidence to Lisa's sister, she didn't hesitate. "It's Heather. I'm sure of it," she said. Heather's reputation for being tightly wound and overly involved in everyone's business wasn't news to anyone in the neighborhood. But no one expected her to be at the center of something so dark. Armed with this new information, the detectives began focusing on Heather, subtly probing her without revealing their suspicions. Heather's calm demeanor couldn't last forever. When Detective Marlowe came to her house to ask routine questions, Heather greeted him with a tight smile and offered rehearsed answers. "Lisa and I weren't close," she said. "I don't know much about her personal life." But Marlowe wasn't buying it. He noticed the way her hands fidgeted with her coffee mug and how her eyes darted around the room when she answered. When he casually asked about her whereabouts the night before Lisa's death, Heather stammered. I was home all night," she said quickly. It wasn't a definitive lie, but it was enough to raise suspicion. Marlowe left Heather's house with more questions than answers, and he was determined to get to the truth. As the investigation continued, Evan found himself in the spotlight. Detective Marlowe had questions about his relationship with Lisa, and Evan's initial shock gave way to guilt. He admitted to the affair with Heather, but insisted it was over months ago. "Lisa knew," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I think that's what started all this." Marlowe didn't let Evan off the hook so easily. "Do you think Heather had anything to do with Lisa's death?" he asked. Evan hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't want to believe that. But Heather, she's unpredictable. When things ended, she didn't take it well." Evan's statement painted a clearer picture for the detectives. Heather wasn't just a scorned lover, she was a woman on the edge, desperate to protect her secrets at any cost. The turning point in the investigation came when the pills found in Lisa's car were traced back to a black market supplier. Detective Marlowe dug deeper and uncovered a surprising detail. Heather's bank records showed a withdrawal that matched the payment for the pills. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tie her to the crime. Confronted with this evidence, Heather began to unravel. She admitted to buying the pills, but insisted it was never meant to harm Lisa. "It was a stupid prank," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted to scare her. I didn't think." But the damage was done. Lisa was dead, and Heather's excuses couldn't erase the mounting evidence against her. When the police arrived at Heather's home with a warrant for her arrest, the entire neighborhood seemed to pause. Mothers picking up their children from school whispered in hushed tones, while neighbors peeked from behind their curtains as Heather was led out in handcuffs. The perfect PTA mom, always so composed, was now the center of a scandal no one could ignore. The charges were damning: reckless endangerment and manslaughter. Detective Marlowe had built a strong case, tying the threatening texts, the black market sedatives, and Heather's tense relationship with Lisa into a web of motive and opportunity. Heather's lawyer, a sharp-tongued man named Richard Klein, immediately claimed Heather was being scapegoated. "There's no evidence Heather administered the pills," he told reporters. But the damage to Heather's reputation was already done. The tight-knit community began to unravel as everyone picked sides, some supporting Heather, others convinced of her guilt. Heather's trial began 6 months later, and Evan was one of the first witnesses called to the stand. His testimony was critical in establishing the chain of events leading up to Lisa's death. Nervous but determined, Evan detailed his affair with Heather and how Lisa had discovered the truth. "Lisa confronted me, but she also confronted Heather," Evan admitted, his voice shaking. "She wasn't angry, she just wanted it to stop." Heather's lawyer jumped on the statement, arguing that Lisa's reaction proved she wasn't a threat to Heather. But the prosecution countered with Evan's description of Heather's escalating paranoia after the confrontation. Did Heather ever threaten Lisa directly? The prosecutor asked. Evan hesitated. Not that I know of, he said. But she was scared of losing everything. She told me she'd do whatever it took to protect her family. The courtroom fell silent as his words hung in the air. It was clear Heather's desperation had driven her to dangerous lengths. The prosecution's strongest evidence was the series of text messages Heather had sent to Lisa. Each one painted a picture of a woman teetering on the edge. The jury listened intently as the prosecutor read them aloud. Stay out of my way. You'll regret it if you keep pushing me. Some things are better left alone. Heather's lawyer argued that the texts were vague, more emotional outbursts than actual threats. But combined with the sedative's purchase and Heather's connection to Lisa's final moments, they became a damning piece of the puzzle. As the prosecution rested its case, Heather's composed facade began to slip. She knew the evidence against her was overwhelming. The jury wasn't just hearing about her actions, they were beginning to understand the fear and jealousy that had consumed her. The trial had a ripple effect on the community. Friends who had once stood shoulder to shoulder at bake sales and soccer games now found themselves on opposite sides of a heated debate. Some neighbors defended Heather, calling her a good mother who had made a terrible mistake. She's not a murderer, said one PTA member in a local news interview. She's just someone who got caught up in a bad situation. Others were less sympathetic. She knew what she was doing, another neighbor argued. Lisa's dead because Heather couldn't handle the truth. The tension boiled over during a PTA meeting, where an argument about fundraising turned into a shouting match over the trial. The once peaceful suburb had become a battleground, its shiny exterior cracking under the weight of betrayal and tragedy. When Heather took the stand in her own defense, she appeared fragile but determined. Dressed in a plain navy suit, her hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone. I never wanted Lisa to get hurt, she began, her voice breaking. I was scared. I felt cornered. I made terrible choices, but I didn't kill her. Her lawyer guided her through a narrative of fear and desperation, painting Heather as a victim of circumstance rather than a manipulative schemer. I sent those texts because I was angry and frustrated, Heather said. I bought the pills to scare her, not to hurt her. But the cross-examination was brutal. The prosecutor pressed her on why she hadn't come forward earlier. If it was just a prank, why didn't you call the police when Lisa died? He asked. Heather's silence spoke volumes. As the trial entered its third week, the jury's body language hinted at the weight of their deliberations. Some leaned forward during testimony, scribbling notes, while others avoided eye contact with Heather entirely. The defense had planted seeds of doubt by emphasizing the lack of direct evidence tying Heather to Lisa's death. There's no proof Heather gave Lisa the pills, Richard Klein argued. This is a tragic misunderstanding, not a murder. But the prosecution countered with a devastating timeline, showing how Heather's actions aligned with Lisa's final hours. She bought the sedatives. She sent the threats. And Lisa is dead because of her, the prosecutor said, his voice ringing with conviction. The jury was torn. Was Heather a desperate woman who made a terrible mistake, or was she calculated, willing to cross any line to protect her secret? The turning point came when one of Heather's neighbors, Susan, was called to the stand. Susan had always been observant, and her testimony provided chilling insight into Heather's state of mind leading up to Lisa's death. She seemed unhinged, Susan said. I overheard her on the phone one night, pacing in her backyard. She said something like, I'll fix this myself if I have to. Under cross-examination, Klein dismissed Susan's statement as hearsay. But the damage was done. The jury couldn't ignore the picture Susan painted of a woman on the verge of snapping. As the trial dragged on, Evan's guilt began to surface more clearly. Though he wasn't on trial, his role in the events leading to Lisa's death couldn't be ignored. He had lit the match, after all, and left Heather to deal with the fallout. During his second appearance on the stand, Evan broke down. I should have stopped it sooner, he admitted. I let things spiral out of control, and Lisa paid the price. His confession didn't absolve Heather, but it added a layer of complexity to the case. Was Heather truly the villain, or was she a product of a toxic situation that Evan helped create? Just when it seemed the trial had reached its peak, a shocking piece of evidence emerged. Detective Marlowe presented a recording from Lisa's voicemail. It was a message left by Heather the day before Lisa's death. The courtroom fell silent as the recording played. "Lisa, we need to talk. This can't keep going on. You're ruining my life, and I can't take it anymore. Meet me at the school parking lot tomorrow morning. Let's settle this once and for all." Heather's lawyer objected, arguing the message was ambiguous, but the prosecution seized the moment. This wasn't an invitation to talk, it was a trap, they said. Heather lured Lisa to her death. Both sides delivered powerful closing arguments, each appealing to the jury's sense of justice. The prosecution painted Heather as a manipulative, desperate woman whose actions led to Lisa's tragic death. "She didn't pull a trigger or swing a knife, but she set everything in motion," the prosecutor said. The defense, however, urged the jury to see Heather as a flawed but human figure. "She made mistakes, yes. But mistakes aren't murder. The evidence doesn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she killed Lisa." As the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Heather sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached a decision. The courtroom was packed as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. "On the charge of manslaughter, we find the defendant, Heather Monroe, guilty." Gasps rippled through the room. Heather's face crumpled as the weight of the words sank in. Her lawyer placed a hand on her shoulder, but it did little to comfort her. The judge sentenced Heather to 10 years in prison, citing her reckless actions and their devastating consequences. For Lisa's family, it wasn't enough, but it was something. The trial may have ended, but its impact reverberated through the community. Heather's children were pulled from school, their once stable lives shattered. Evan moved away, unable to face the whispers and judgment. Lisa's family struggled to heal, haunted by the loss of a wife and mother who deserved so much more. The suburb, once idyllic, became a reminder of the secrets, betrayals, and tragedies that had unfolded behind its pristine picket fences. And Heather? She sat in her cell, replaying every decision that led her there, wondering if there was ever a moment she could have chosen differently. After the trial, Evan became a ghost of his former self. He sold his house and moved to a small apartment in a neighboring town, but he couldn't escape the guilt that followed him. His children were distant, blaming him for the chaos that had consumed their family. Evan spent most of his days avoiding people, afraid of the judgment he saw in every glance. He stopped attending social events, quit his job, and began drinking more than he cared to admit. One night, he sat in his darkened living room, staring at a photo of Lisa and the kids. "What have I done?" he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Evan knew he couldn't undo the past, but he was determined to make things right for his children. He began attending therapy and working toward rebuilding his fractured relationship with them. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. The trial had left the once affluent suburb fractured. Neighbors who had once shared laughs at block parties now crossed the street to avoid each other. The tight-knit community had become a place of mistrust and unease. At school meetings, parents whispered about Heather's children, speculating on how they were coping. Some tried to reach out, offering support, while others openly avoided them, as if the scandal were contagious. The PTA tried to restore a sense of normalcy, but the annual bake sale and holiday events felt hollow. No one wanted to talk about the trial, yet it lingered in every conversation. The suburb's pristine image had been irreparably tarnished. Heather's children, Emma and Jake, bore the brunt of the fallout. At school, they were met with whispers and judgmental stares. Teachers tried to shield them from the gossip, but it was impossible to escape. Emma, the older of the two, withdrew into herself, spending hours alone in her room. Jake, still young enough to crave answers, frequently asked his grandparents why his mom wasn't coming home. "She made a mistake," they would say gently, but it didn't soothe his confusion. The siblings leaned on each other, finding solace in their shared pain. Over time, Emma became fiercely protective of Jake, determined to shield him from the cruel world that had turned against them. Lisa's sister, Danielle, couldn't let go of the anger she felt toward Heather and Evan. While the trial had provided some closure, it wasn't enough. Lisa's death left a gaping hole in her life, and she channeled her grief into action. Danielle began volunteering with a local organization that supported victims of domestic abuse and families affected by violent crimes. She spoke openly about Lisa's story, using it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked jealousy and betrayal. Her advocacy work gave her a sense of purpose, but every time she spoke at an event, she couldn't help but feel the ache of Lisa's absence. "She should be here," Danielle would say, her voice trembling with emotion. Even the children in the neighborhood weren't immune to the ripple effects. Friends of Heather's kids began asking uncomfortable questions at home, forcing parents to have difficult conversations about what had happened. One family decided to move entirely, citing the toxic environment the trial had created. Others quietly distanced themselves from the Monroes, worried about how the scandal might affect their own reputations. The innocence of the suburb had been shattered. The children, once carefree and oblivious to adult problems, now understood far too much about betrayal, loss, and consequences. Detective Marlowe, the man who had pieced together the case, couldn't shake the impact it had on him. As a seasoned investigator, he had seen his share of tragedy, but Lisa's death lingered in his mind. He often thought about Heather's spiral into desperation and how easily it could have been avoided if someone had intervened earlier. "People like to think these things don't happen in nice neighborhoods," he told his partner one evening. "But they do. They just hide it better." Marlowe's work on the case earned him a commendation, but it felt hollow. For him, justice wasn't just about solving a case, it was about preventing another tragedy like Lisa's. Months after the trial, the neighborhood began to slowly piece itself back together. A new family moved into Heather's old house, hoping for a fresh start. The PTA organized a charity event to honor Lisa, donating the proceeds to causes she had supported. While some saw these efforts as a step toward healing, others felt they were performative, a way to mask the lingering fractures. The truth was, the community would never be the same. The trial had exposed the cracks beneath its perfect facade, and no amount of charity events could erase that. Months turned into years, and the events surrounding Lisa's death became a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of schools and coffee shops across the town. The community would never fully heal, but it had learned a harsh truth. Behind the manicured lawns and white picket fences, no life is as perfect as it seems. Heather's children eventually moved away, building lives of their own far from the shadow of their mother's mistakes. Evan struggled to rebuild his relationship with his children, but found some peace through therapy and a commitment to being a better father. Lisa's family, led by Danielle, turned their grief into action, raising awareness about the dangers of unchecked jealousy, betrayal, and emotional manipulation. Detective Marlowe, now retired, often drove past the neighborhood that had once been the center of the case. He'd pause for a moment, thinking of Lisa and how a series of small, selfish decisions had led to such a senseless tragedy. The suburb remained a picture of affluence on the surface, but the cracks in its foundation were a reminder to everyone that secrets don't stay buried forever. The story of Lisa, Heather, and Evan became a stark reminder that choices have consequences, and even the smallest betrayal can ripple into unimaginable devastation. Thank you for joining us on this intense journey. Stories like this remind us of the importance of self-reflection and the danger of letting fear and jealousy take control of our lives. If you enjoyed this crime story and want to hear more gripping stories like it, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Heather's shoes? And do you think justice was truly served? We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned for more stories that captivate, inspire, and remind us of the complexities of human nature. Thank you, and see you in the next story.